This allows us to compare approaches between European countries and also compare the approach of China to various European countries, and to have I guess, a more in-depth understanding of these relations and of these dynamics. So the topic for this year's report is China's soft power in Europe. I will not say anything about the content because there will be other speakers who will do this after me. We have a great expression of interest, so about 200 people registered for this webinar, which will also be live streamed or is being live streamed on YouTube. The session has a very straightforward structure. There will be 4 introductions, after which there will be time for Q&A and discussion. We have until 3:15, so we have 1 hour and 15 minutes in all for the session. And I will briefly introduce the speakers, our speakers today, and they will speak in the same order as they are announced in the announcement for this session. So first will speak Ties Dams, my colleague at Clingendael Institute. So we are based in The Hague, and Ties has been acting as the overall coordinator for this year's report. And he's also one of the authors of the introductory chapter. So Ties will give a general outline of the report and of the introduction to the report. And then we have 3 speakers from 3 different country chapters, the authors of three different country chapters. First will speak. The first who will speak is Francesca Ghiretti from the Italian think tank IAI. Francesca is speaking to us today from London, actually, not from Rome. And then after Marc Julienne will speak. He's based in Paris for the French think tank Affari. And then the third country perspective speaker will be Barbara Pongratz, based in Berlin and working at MERICS, about the German perspective. So that's the lineup for the speakers, for the introductions. So after the introductions, we will still have, I think, expect about 45 minutes for the speakers to engage in debate, of course, with each other, but of course also with you, the audience. If you have a question you want to ask, you can use the Q&A function. It's probably visible at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, you can enter your questions. You can enter your questions at any time. And then there will be an opportunity for the speakers to engage in those questions. And I, as moderator, will try to pick as many of those questions as possible as time allows for the speakers to engage with. That's it for my introduction, and so I would now like to ask Ties to go ahead and give us his presentation. Ties?
Thank you, Frans-Paul, and thank you. All of you are here and still dropping in, over 100 people I see, for engaging in such an urgent and interesting topic, China's soft power in Europe. I thought I'd start with the basics, say a little bit about the title of the report and its main observation, and then go deep into 3 things. First of all, what we've discovered about China's approach to projecting soft power in different countries. Secondly, about the way that approach is being perceived and received in various European societies. And third, what lessons we may draw from the observations made in the first 2 points. Well, the title of the report is China's soft power in Europe falling on hard times. And indeed, our main observation is that across the board, China's soft power in Europe is falling on hard times. China is being received in different countries in different ways, but still across the board steadily in a more politicized manner. This leads to the basic conclusion that, as we see it, China's ability to influence preferences and behavior of European audiences, both elite and general, through specifically attraction and persuasion, and this is the way we've defined soft power, has fallen. So that Chinese soft power has fallen, and indeed is, as we speak, perhaps falling dramatically. This is in and of itself not a wholly innovative idea. Many of you in the audience will be fully aware of sanctions by the PRC being laid on various European actors, and a deterioration of relations between China and various aspects of Europe. But what our report does, and I think what we today in this webinar can discuss, is what lies behind that drop in approval ratings. This too has been widely publicized. There's all sorts of surveys, some of them done by our members. We show very clearly and very interestingly that general approval ratings of China and Chinese leadership across European societies are dropping. The big question is, what kind of dynamic is behind that, and what does that do to both the Chinese approach to projecting soft power in Europe and to European responses to Chinese policies? So let's dive into that. To be able to look beyond the headlines and the incidents, this report has distilled from some of the main trends from across all those different countries and EU institutions over the last 10 years. And in the first instance, it has looked at what kind of layers there are to Chinese soft power policy towards Europe in those last 10 years. And basically, we have distinguished 3 layers. And the basic layer comes from a statement made by Hu Jintao in 2007, where he says that the great rejuvenation of China must be accompanied by a thriving of Chinese culture across the globe. And this basic layer is thus aimed at promoting Chinese culture through cultural exchange, educational exchange, research exchange. And this basic layer of the policy toolkit is virtually the same in every country, although there are some interesting differences. It is relatively stable after a strong growth in for instance, Confucius Institutes. It has remained relatively stable. And it is very much aimed at promoting an attractive image of China to the world. So this basic layer is indeed still present and has reached somewhat of a stable part of its growth in many European countries. The secondary layer, or the second layer, it becomes a bit more complex and difficult. This layer refers to the secondary effects of economic cooperation. So in defining soft power, the big question is, where does soft power end? We have defined it as the ability to influence preferences and behavior through persuasion and attraction rather than payment or coercion. Now, an investment agreement, for instance, or a concrete investment by China in a European country may in itself exist in the form of payment, but it may have important secondary soft power effects because it is accompanied by a PR strategy, for instance, that is aimed at promoting the attractiveness and indeed the persuasiveness of China beyond that measure of payment. So this is an important part of Chinese soft power toolkit, although it in stricto sensu isn't purely soft power promotion itself. And 2 platforms are important, the BRI and the 17+1 platforms. Now, different countries will have very different experiences with that, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The third layer is perhaps the most dynamic, and that refers to the use of media, social media, and political messaging by Chinese representatives. This is interesting. I think 2 things are worth mentioning. First of all, China has been, as many of our country chapters show, seeking to slowly but steadily build a presence in the media spaces of the respective countries. And indeed, this differs a lot between countries. So in some countries, there is quite a strong presence is pursued, and others not so much. Virtually everywhere, although some cases stand out. In the last 2 to 3 years, Chinese representatives have been looking for a very strong presence on social media. And this is particularly interesting, but also very new. So it's still very hard to properly analyze the effects. But that it is and has become a big part of that Chinese soft power projection, I think is pretty clear. I think Marc will be able maybe to say something about that too in his French chapter, or indeed in the discussion. So these 3 layers, very quickly summarized, is what's been happening for the last 10 years when it comes to Chinese soft power approach to Europe. The basic question, of course, is, has it worked? Our report concludes that in many cases it hasn't. But it hasn't in 4 different distinct and interesting ways. We categorize the perceptions and responses to Chinese soft power approach in Europe in 4 groups. So that the European societies and the way they have received and responded to Chinese soft power approach can be categorized in 4 groups. I'll just go through them more quickly, and we can go into depth, because indeed the coming speakers will represent 3 of those 4 groups. The first group is the group where China isn't very actively seeking to expand its soft power, because it is actually it is maintaining good relations, but despite very limited visibility. And this is Austria, Hungary, Poland, Portugal, and Slovakia. And in these countries, often Chinese soft power promotion is exclusively aimed at the elite and not so much at the general audience, and it's trying to keep that way. It's interesting that here Chinese soft power seems biggest, but it's in a way also least visible. Then the second group, Group B, and to this group, 2 countries belong, Italy and Greece. So Francesca, you'll be able to say a lot more about this. We see considerable appeal of China. But also we see China being shifted to more of a damage control mode, because some of the spark has gone. Also, what we see in these countries is that the economic base of China's appeal is very strong. Then the third group, here we see China struggling with growing vigilance amongst its audiences. And this is a large group, to which Germany, Latvia, the Netherlands, Romania, Spain, the UK, and in a way the EU institutions belong. Here we see that over the past 10 years, first there was a very steady, a very slow increase in interest in China, and also an increase in cultural appeal of China. But that any progress booked in that time has been undone by basically a loss of appeal in the last 2 years and a growing need for vigilance. And then there's a last group, and we've called that the free fall group. Here, China seems to have dropped in appeal and attraction so much that you might wonder whether projecting soft power is still a viable strategic goal. To this group, the Czech Republic, Denmark, France, Sweden belong. Now, as I've said before, we can go into depth for some of these groups and some of these countries in the presentations afterwards. But I would, before I return the floor to the other speakers, like to point to some general lessons we can draw from this playing field as we've seen it. And I think the first lesson is that aspects previously innocuous of the European relationship to China are losing their innocence in many cases. So the seemingly soft promotion of culture, educational exchange is in many countries steadily being received in a more politicized manner. So this reflects in an interesting way on that base layer of soft power policy that Hu Jintao initiated. The second important lesson, I think, is that China's soft power approach in and of itself is of negligible or at least small importance. Economic prowess is still the most viable aspect of its image promotion policies, and China's domestic political setup, including the situation in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong, its relationship to the US, and indeed COVID, are these factors determining its general appeal amongst European audiences far more than its own policies of promoting soft power. Indeed, economic prowess or China's economic appeal only seems to take a back seat to other factors when these politicized factors like Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Sino-US relations, or COVID become dominant in the debate on China. And this leads us to, I think, a third lesson or conclusion, in that in the last 2 to 3 years, we see that China seems to be communicating that it prefers to be respected, if not feared, rather than liked, which has some significant consequences for the way we think about soft power in China-European relations. And I think at least it may have 2 consequences, and then I'll stop. I think China challenges Europe to take to think and strategize beyond soft power, purely defined. China seems to be changing its strategic logic from promoting appeal to winning persuasive or even coercive power in a global discursive space where values are fundamentally contested, where it feels both threatened and more audacious, and where non-material and material sources of power are entwined. And so I think for Europe, although national experiences differ, and they differ greatly, and this is one of the things that comes forward so richly in this report, the deeper challenge posed by China is shared to make European societies collectively more competitive in an essentially contested discursive space of great power relations. This is what Representative Well, of course, more popularly calls the battle of narratives. That poses some serious issues and challenges, not just to Europe's relation to China, but to Europe in general. So that leads me to conclude that China may be falling on hard times, but as a consequence, Europe may be too. Frans-Paul, back to you.
Thank you, Thies. Thank you very much for this introduction to the introduction of the report and the bigger overview. So you have a very important role in this debate, because you have, from all of us, you have the best knowledge of what is in all the different country chapters. In view of the time, I would like to move on now to the first speaker for the individual country chapters. All the country chapters, I can assure you, are very interesting and very worthwhile. We do not only have chapters on individual countries. There's also one chapter in the report that is about the EU institutions to complement the national points of view. That was provided to the report by the EU ISS, the European think tank based in Paris. So now we move on to Italy. So I just wanted to say it was, we would have preferred to be able to use this webinar to present all the country chapters and all the chapters in the report, but obviously this was not possible. So we have Italy, France, and Germany represented here today. So Francesca, I saw in the Q&A box that there's actually already one question posed to you, even though you haven't even started speaking yet. But I suppose it's better if we just do the introduction that you prepared first, and then we will move to the questions later on. So Francesca.
Thank you, Frans-Paul. First of all, thank you to Clingendael for hosting and organizing this event, and for all the authors for contributing to such a timely report. On the side of Italy, I co-authored our chapter with Lorenzo Mariani, who is a colleague of mine at IAI. And what we identified were 2 main areas in which Chinese soft power works in Italy. One is economy, as it has already been mentioned by Thies, and the other one is culture. So in regard to economy, originally this was mainly aimed at political and economic elites in Italy. And it worked particularly well with some economic elites and with the Italian left. Historically, the Italian left and China have very strong, well, and Beijing have very strong ties. And then progressively, the sort of charm became more public as business and people in general realized that China was a growing market, a market with a lot of opportunities. And so a market that could be to a certain degree exploited, both with Italian enterprises going to China and Chinese enterprises investing in Italy. Of course, this is just one side of the story. Because of the highly manufacturing relying economy that is Italy, there is also the side of the business community that has been particularly wary of Chinese economic presence in Italy because of the competition that Chinese enterprises place on Italian manufacturing enterprises. We know that eventually this will move on also to services, so the picture becomes even more complicated. But there's a sort of area that composes a bridge between the economic side of the soft power and the cultural side of the soft power. And I think that is education. I know that people might think, well, no, education belongs to culture. But one of the main drivers for students to start studying Chinese culture, but mostly Mandarin, was the idea that it would give them an advantage in a very competitive job market. The idea that because Chinese market was growing and Italian business was increasingly interested in expanding in a Chinese market, then, you know, at least knowing China and speaking Mandarin would give them an advantage. Interestingly, though, most of the programs, most of the curricula offered by Italian universities that cover China are literature or culture based. There are not that many that are technical or business based, yet this kind of thought still remained. And so moving on to culture, what is interesting beyond academia is the fact that there is literally a countless number of cultural associations and organizations spread throughout the territory. And they're so rooted in the territory that, you know, a proper mapping has revealed to be particularly complex, because some of them are very small, some of them are partnership between cities, between very small realities within China and Italy. And all these cultural organizations organize events and so try to enhance cultural knowledge and understanding between Italy and China. Linked to both, so the cultural organization and the academia, are the Confucius Institutes, which in Italy there are 16 Confucius Institutes, which I think is one of the highest number within the European Union. And interestingly, in Italy, we didn't have that debate regarding Confucius Institutes, which raised wariness about their role, what they were communicating, how they worked. Confucius Institutes are very well seen. They're still working pretty well. Nobody is really putting under question their existence and their collaboration with Italian universities. Right, I forgot to say, between Italian universities and Chinese universities at the moment, there are 932 collaboration agreements, which is quite a high number. And 300 of these are between top tier universities. Now, not all of these are between faculties who study Chinese and Chinese universities. Some of these are more technical between, for example, universities where there is science and technology development and the Chinese research centers or universities that cover that same topic. To conclude, because I know I have very little time, so to conclude, if we look more broadly at the public effort made by China to communicate cultural closeness between Italy and China, there's often reference to Italy and China sharing, you know, a past where they both had ancient civilizations, where they both had a particular sensibility for art and culture. They often mention the fact that Italy is first in the UNESCO World Heritage Sites and China is second. And then, of course, they mentioned the fact that they were connected, they were linked by the Silk Road, which only makes sense now that in 2019, Italy became part of the BRI to, you know, bring back this sort of narrative as we were connected in the past. past. Now we're still connected in the present. Just last remark, as Thies was saying, Italy's view of China is still rather positive. It is becoming slightly more negative, but it's still, if we look at the average in the European Union, it's still rather positive. But again, because of all the communication around China, because China is becoming so central and important and is being talked about a lot, much of the positive view that was previously there is slowly decreasing. And I think I'll conclude my remarks with this.
Thank you very much, Francesca. And let's move on now to the next country on the list, which is France. Marc, can you complement Francesca's Italian point of view with the French one?
Yes, thank you very much, Frans-Paul, and thanks to Clingendael for the great work on the report and for organizing this event. So I co-authored the chapter on France together with John Seaman, who is probably watching us right now, so I have to be careful about what I'm saying. And so as far as France is concerned, China's soft power strategy in France was pretty basic or traditional for the past 10 to 15 years. It was based first on deepening linguistic and cultural connections. The first Confucius Institute was established in 2005, and today there are over 20 institutes in France, including overseas departments and territories. And like in other countries, there has been few controversies regarding those institutes, especially when they attempted to weigh or to influence within the governments of public universities. The academic cooperation, like in Italy, between China and France is indeed very dynamic, which many partnerships between French and Chinese universities and many French business and engineering schools having a campus in China. In 2019, 11,000 French students were studying in China and 30,000 Chinese students were in France. Chinese media outlets have also expanded their presence in France over the last decade and are now becoming more and more active on social media. For example, Xinhua, CGTN as a national TV, and China Radio International all present content in French. Still, the overall impact of Chinese media in France does not appear particularly significant so far. Of course, the economic pull factor are very strong in France, and the draw of business opportunities in China is attracting many young people to learn Chinese. This is also why business schools are settling in China, as I just mentioned. Indeed, China has not hesitated to brandish such opportunities in packaging itself as an indispensable partner to France. China also cultivates a network of elite connections in the political, industrial, and cultural sectors through person-to-person relationship, but also through business and cultural elite clubs. Many of you probably know the close relationship some former French prime ministers maintain with the Chinese power, like Jean-Pierre Affarin or Dominique de Villepin, and also former minister Jean-Louis Borloo. And China's image has certainly benefited from their vocal and forceful support. Jean-Louis Borloo, for instance, so former minister in France, was a member of Huawei France's board until July 2020, and he has been replaced by Jean-Marie Le Guen, who is a former MP and a former Secretary of State, who also sits on the boards of Swissport and Gate Holding, two subsidiaries of the major Chinese conglomerate HNA. However, all what I just described has been overshadowed by a much more aggressive Chinese public diplomacy over the last year, and particularly since the onset of the COVID-19 crisis. This aggressive approach has particularly taken the shape of a much more visible presence by the Chinese embassy in France and the Chinese ambassador himself in both traditional and social media, as well as postings of op-eds on the Chinese embassy's website. This trend escalated in spring 2020, as France was facing its first peak in the pandemic. The Chinese embassy's discourse aggressively targeting the French media, the French experts, as well as MPs, for the stance on China, which the embassy considers biased or unfounded. It also retaliated by attacking the French response to the pandemic. And then during the summer 2020, the national security law imposed in Hong Kong and the new revelations on the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang triggered a public outcry in France, with very negative media coverage and tougher stances by French MPs, also pushing the government official to react. French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian, for instance, before the Assemblée Nationale in July 2020, strongly condemned the grave human rights violation in Xinjiang and called for the camps to be closed. So the new trend of the Chinese diplomacy in France is also the warnings, the threats and insults against individuals, MPs and researchers like Raphael Glucksmann of the European Parliament or Antoine Bondaz, my colleague from the Foundation for Strategic Research. These aggressive positions by the Chinese embassy led the Chinese ambassador to be summoned by the French MFA 2 times within a year, a situation without precedent in the history of the bilateral relation. So here we are in this vicious circle. On the one hand, the Chinese embassy's attitude is deteriorating China's image in France and is pushing many media to watch even more closely China's narrative and acts. And at the same time, this attitude is putting China's voices of support in France in a very difficult position and sometimes forced to stand aloof from China. On the other hand, Beijing's harsh policies in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, as well as towards Taiwan, are inevitably pushing the French public opinion and the government towards tougher positions. The consequences of this vicious circle is that China, which was clearly overlooked for years, is now emerging in the French policy debate. Media, MPs, and public administrations are more and more interested in, and to a certain extent, concerned by China. So to conclude, it seems like Beijing has purely renounced to soft power in France. Particularly, the Chinese ambassador to France appears more keener to confront and hit back at critics, rather than to show restraint and promote dialogue. And this proves very detrimental to the bilateral relationship currently. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marc, for your introduction. Let's just quickly move on to the next country. Barbara, would you like to give us your introduction on Germany?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. I'm just going to share my one slide I prepared. Can you see it now? Yeah. Wonderful. Yes. Okay. Also from my side, big thanks to Clingendael for all your work on the report and for organizing this. I'm happy to present a few key points from my Germany chapter. So I would like to divide my statement in 3 brief parts and a lesson at the end. So the title of my chapter is A Strong Economic Appeal and Competing Values. So my first point is that China's government has mostly relied on a more traditional toolkit to exert soft power in Germany in the last decade. This toolkit consisted of government-enabled education and research cooperation and cultural exchanges. A MERICS study in 2018 found that China's importance at universities has been growing since the 90s. However, the number of students who have studied in China or have studied Chinese in Germany peaked in 2013 and 14. In my report chapter, I additionally identify 3 partly non-transparent channels of influence that China has used in the past 10 years. One channel being media cooperation, another second channel being lobbying and elite exchanges, and a third channel being research and education cooperation. So this traditional soft power effort and these 3 channels of influence show China's efforts at successfully exercising soft power in Germany in the last decade in a partly non-transparent manner. Nevertheless, these efforts have largely been effective and beneficial to China's image. And in addition, which brings me to my second point, in an export-dependent economy like Germany's, the economic appeal of the Chinese market continues to influence German perceptions in favor of China. So close business ties often result in a general reluctance to antagonize Beijing publicly in Germany. However, recently this Chinese economic appeal and the non-transparent channels of influence have been more broadly debated and viewed more critically in Germany. So the debate has intensified in the media, for example. Political issues are becoming part of mainstream debate in China, on China, and also in the German think tank community. The debate has intensified, and most important, in the business and politics arena, with business associations like the BDI having initially published the paper stating that China is, among other roles, a systemic rival. Which brings me to summarizing again my second point. So the Chinese economic appeal in Germany is quite strong, but loses its charm due to increased critical debate. And especially because Germany appears willing to question this economic appeal and openly criticize Chinese methods of influence, the effectiveness of Chinese soft power in Germany has dwindled, which I find in the chapter. And as mentioned, the debate has intensified. So in parallel to that, China's activities to proactively shape its image have also intensified. Which leads me to my third point. China had to become more assertive and use coercive measures in Germany, and consequently suffered an image loss. So Chinese government representatives now use social media propaganda campaigns in Germany. They use programmed bots or non-transparent influencing strategies or threats to German companies, like the Chinese ambassador Putten threatened the German car industry would suffer should Germany exclude Huawei from the 5G network construction. Or also another example, Chinese diplomats used social media channels to urge German officials at the Foreign Office to report on China's handling of the coronavirus crisis in a positive manner. So these actions definitely had a coercive feel to it. And German reactions to this assertiveness are largely negative, with criticism towards China intensifying. Therefore, surveys, the results of a survey from Pew Research Centre in October 2020 has shown that the unfavorable perception of China has been at its highest level since the Pew Research Centre began carrying out surveys on this topic in Germany 15 years ago, as already mentioned by Thies. And also surveys have shown that the Germans are not in favor of the Chinese political system after looking at the Chinese government's handling of the coronavirus crisis, especially the early cover-up of the virus spread. So that was one main finding of my chapter. China's authoritarianism remains off-putting to Germans, and it is also the main obstacle to an overall positive view of China and Germany. Yeah, which brings me to my final point, which are not on the slides here, but my main lesson and a brief outlook. So the main lesson for my country chapter that is relevant for the broader EU-China perspective is that we need to proactively request transparency, especially in research and education cooperation. It's important to request funding structures. These inquiries often cost money. That has been the case for inquiries about Confucius Institutes funding in the south of Germany, for example, or in requests to universities who receive a couple of million fundings from the Chinese government or Huawei. So we need to monitor where the capital is channeled, and that also has to be determined by law. So we need transparency rules for cooperation with authoritarian states. And that leads me to my final point. A closely related topic is the mutual imposition of sanctions very recently. These sanctions mark an escalation in EU-China relations, where MERICS has been directly affected. More broadly, German and European research is disproportionately heavily affected in this sanctions framework. So that's an attempt at influencing academic freedom in Europe, which is not acceptable. So these sanctions mark a change of situations. So we think that the effects will not be loose, but could lead to more severe consequences on research and education cooperation with China and authoritarian states. So yeah, despite the difficulties, the German government will host government consultations with China at the end of April, implementing a key principle of German-China policy, which is to maintain the dialogue instead of cutting it off. But it's still unclear what effect the consultations will have. But of course, we hope to see a de-escalation of the situation. Thanks, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you for your introduction, Barbara. Before we move on to the questions that were posed to you by the audience, there's one question I would like to ask you as a panel. So in many countries, and also in the report as a whole, one thing that is really striking is the conclusion that the image of China in Europe is deteriorating. So if this indeed is, I mean, given this fact, I wonder, how does this relate to, to China's soft power? I mean, obviously, with a deteriorating image, it's becoming more difficult for China to exert soft power in Europe. I'm, wondering about your views. How is this affecting China's approach to Europe, China's overall approach? So we've been discussing China's soft power approach to Europe, but how is the deteriorating image of China in Europe affecting the overall strategy, the overall approach that China is using towards Europe and European countries? Perhaps if you can say something from your own perspective, from each of your perspectives, perhaps starting with Thies, with the report's overall point of view. How do you look at this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a very central one. I think, first of all, it's a time we start unpicking this concept of soft power. So I think losing likability or attractiveness does not mean you're becoming less persuasive or indeed legitimate in the eyes of others. And to have a wider look or a more comprehensive look at the way these non-material sources of power can be used by countries like China must lead to the conclusion that China may be losing appeal. Well, it is definitely losing appeal, but at least at certain points, it is very quickly being recognized as a force to be reckoned with by many European governments as well as general audiences. So that is, in and of itself, I think, at least in part, an important win. So just to conclude that is all bad news for China is I think missing part of the story. There have been all kinds of studies towards Chinese theories of soft power or related concepts like Julienne or discursive power that indeed have such a more comprehensive image, looking at the world as this discursive web in which players have a limited amount of influence and can only win influence where others lose. And I think China is trying to win a certain right to speak or be heard in international discourse, sometimes at the cost of likability or appeal. Well, I think that's central to understanding why at least some Chinese representatives are pursuing policies that are actively hurting their country's image and likability. So it's more multidimensional than the simple approval ratings in the Pew Global Research show. And I think that's when you start to strategize towards China, it's important to take that on. Well, the question how this deterioration of image will lead to change Chinese policies towards European audiences. I'm very curious actually to see whether the post-COVID era will launch a new period of trying to get closer ties again. So I think in some countries, ties have deteriorated in such a way that's not a very viable option. But in other countries like the Netherlands, I'm wondering whether the post-COVID era will once again show a different side of China's approach towards European society. So that's a question I have on that front, and I'm not sure what my hypothesis will be, but I think things have been changing so quickly over the last 2 years. It's very important to think ahead and what may happen after this particular factor will start pushing on Chinese-European relations. So I'll just leave it at that. I think there's much more to be said.
Would you like to add something to this, Francesca? Yes, please.
So just very quickly, I think that there are two elements that will change. One, it would be more difficult to occupy that gray zone that Europeans in general like so much. The idea of leaving that space of maneuver to decide what to do according to the single particular issue. And that might become more difficult as China becomes more entrenched in a particular position and a particular narrative. And the second element is whether Europeans, and I'm thinking about Italy foremost, would be increasingly subject to external influence. So we've seen in the case of 5G how important the US was of an actor in shaping the European position. So I'm just wondering how much, that will become a factor. And what I'm seeing is that, there is also an increasing number of European member states governments that are following a more, I want to say, protective approach than they used to. So I just wanted to add these two elements to the conversation.
Thank you, Francesca. Marc, is there anything you would like to add?
Following up on a question, I would maybe phrase it the other way around. How does the deteriorating image of China's deteriorating image influence China's policy? I would say that China's image has probably deteriorated because of China's policy in Europe. And it seems, from the French perspective, as you know, it seems that China today is favoring power struggle and intimidation over attraction and over soft power. So at least for the French case, soft power doesn't seem to be a priority any longer. And it's more about coercion and intimidation, I'd say.
Thank you. Barbara?
Yeah, thanks. I think, most of it has been said already. I think, this discourse of power that Jesus mentioned is also seeming to be more important in Germany. The motivation to shape the narrative is really dominant, and that's definitely also visible here in Germany. So no matter if it's clashing more, that's not a problem as long the narrative is basically dominated. So we've also seen that in Germany a lot. So for example, the Chinese embassy or representatives becoming more active in the media and social media, basically to shape the narratives. Yeah, that's it from my side. Yeah.
Thank you, Barbara. So we have already collected a large number of very interesting questions from the viewers. One question that I would like to begin with to pose to the panel is by Paul van Einde. So his question is, what's the role of the US in the negative view we get on China in Europe? Is there any one of you who would like to respond to this question?
Sorry, Tis, you were going, right?
Francesca, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to follow up on what I said just earlier. If you think about specific issues, then the US did play a role. But at the same time, I would like to also ask the panelists, what role does the US play in reverse in terms of seeing the result of an assertive policy, such an assertive policy from the US? How does it shape the way the European Union approaches to China, and the idea of, trying to still carve out that space of that moderate space that is becoming smaller and smaller? And now I'm thinking about, the Indo-Pacific strategy, for example. And of course, now we have all countries that have an Indo-Pacific strategy except for Italy. So I'm just thinking, in specific issues, I think the US played a central role. And when it comes to government, probably if we look at a political side, then according to how close the government is to the transatlantic agenda, and now, for example, Italy has shifted its position and is very close to the transatlantic agenda, then you might see a starker influence. But I'm also thinking on the overall picture, whether, you know, such a strong position of the US might cause a different sort of backlash in the European Union.
Yeah, if I can follow up on that. Yeah, I think the Trump administration is a very good example, a very good illustration of the role of the US within the EU-China relation. During the 4-year term of Donald Trump, we've seen that the Chinese authorities telling the EU member state and the EU institution, look at what Donald Trump is doing on the international scene. We have much more in common, Chinese and Europeans together, than you have with the Americans on the Iranian nuclear crisis, on climate, on so many issues. We have so much in common. So Trump was an opportunity for China to seduce the European, and as our reports seems to show, this was not successful at all. So even with Donald Trump, which was the best ally to the Chinese to push the European in toward the Chinese, the relation with China has degraded. And now that Joe Biden has arrived in the White House, I think, of course, the situation is even settled. I mean that now it's not. I've also seen a question about does the EU will take side with pick side with the US. I'm not sure it's about picking side. Perhaps the EU can have its own side, but still the EU will still be closer to the United States than from China. And this led us to the discussion we have many times about equidistance, the equidistance concept, which I think it's really not relevant. There is no equidistance in terms of this triangle between the US, Europe, and China.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that too briefly. Sure. I think, yeah, the US definitely does play a role. I think it's also best to look at it with two examples: the EU-China investment agreement and also the human rights issue. So the investment agreement has been, basically in principle concluded in principle last year before Biden came into office, and now it's basically not sure if it will be concluded, especially also with these sanctions situation. So it's shocking, basically striking that we haven't seen sanctions since '89, and now basically after this long Trump time, and we have Biden now, which means that we can work together more closely with Biden. Also the German political landscape, a big part is for a revived partnership with the Biden administration. Now we basically see that Kai is not sure to be concluded anymore. So that's these are these two issues, human rights issues connected with sanctions and the investment agreement, where I think the US definitely does play a role and will also keep on playing a role.
All right. Thies, anything from your side, or should we move on to the next question?
I think just a quick addition, because I think Marc is completely right. And if you're talking about taking sides, I think the question is not which side Europe will take, but in what way it will take a side. So, and just as two broad strokes of options, although the Europe is much closer to the US and has many convergent interests in its relations, in their relations to China, the hard ideological line that Biden seems to be proposing does seem uncomfortable from many a European perspective, and whether seeking closer transatlantic ties on China means joining that kind of discourse or that kind of narrative is I think that's a big question. So Europe could also converge on these issues with a strong and ambitious transatlantic agenda from a more autonomous position, but then and indeed a less ideologically framed position. But then a lot needs to happen still. So I think it's not so much about a distance between the various actors, but the way in which they choose to relate. And therein lies, I think, a very fundamental choice for Europe that will also define its relation to China.
Another question is about the impact of the deteriorating image of China on the national and EU level policies with regard to cooperation with China. So is there anything any one of you can say about whether and how the many research institutes and educational institutes and cultural institutes and companies in Europe who have close ties with counterparts in China, so they are increasingly operating in a context in which the public opinion about China is changing, is shifting in negative direction, but there are still many ongoing forms of cooperation. So is there anything you can say about in what way, or whether and in what way the changing image of China is actually affecting the practical cooperation that is going on?
I can start. Maybe France has one of the worst position, if I may say, but on scientific and academic cooperation, I think the landscape is moving pretty fast this past few months. We talk a lot about the P5 laboratory in Wuhan, and so it comes from a cooperation with France. So we have a lot of now questions raised in France, but also a much more scrutiny on the cooperation that we have in the academia as well as in terms of science. So there's no strict scrutiny or monitoring so far, but there have been recently many press articles investigating the cooperation with Chinese companies or Chinese public institution recently in France, and I think this is a topic that is going to be bigger and bigger on the French policy scene.
Anyone else?
I don't know, Barbara, do you want to go first? Because usually you're always last, so I want to know whether you'd like to go first.
It doesn't really matter. I have a brief point also about research and education cooperation. So in Germany, there's a debate going on about basically giving guidelines, or like there have already been guidelines released by the HRK, which has been an association. So there is, especially in the research and cooperation area, there is already a shift basically of practical cooperation where there has been guidelines of how to monitor basically academic freedom, infringements of academic freedom from the Chinese side. So just by looking at these guidelines, I think the practical cooperation in this area is definitely already impacted in Germany.
Just very briefly on Italy, I think in Italy there's a lot of desire for more collaboration, and we've seen this both in academia but also from institutes. There are a lot of events going on, but at the same time some institutes like the Confucius Institute in Rome, for example, they're trying to keep a very low profile. So when there have been propositions of public events or collaborations, they tend to decline it because they think that would be a negative for their image or negative for their future. And at the same time, this desire for more collaboration is now met by a government who's becoming increasingly stringent in supervising and having a picture of which are the collaborations and how they develop. So I don't know how it will go. Also, Italy tends to change government quite often. So I don't know whether in a year it will be completely different, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on to see whether this keeps developing in a stringent policy towards collaborations with China.
Please, there's another question that I wanted to ask your opinion on. So the question is, has the EU properly handled the soft power approach of China? And could you, reflect on this, both with regard to, the member state governments or European governments and the European Union as a whole? And also, what do you think? And so this question implies that there's a challenge that, there's a challenge for Europe to deal with China's soft power approach. What do you think is the essence of this challenge?
I'm just writing it down. That's a very good question, because indeed the question has Europe handled it well implies a priori defined goals that we have in relation to China's soft power approach. I think at least a couple of things are changing, which forces us to start handling it differently. And that's, first of all, that many different aspects of European countries' relations to China have for a long time been handled separately and are now in terms of public discourse very rapidly becoming connected. So for a long time, all kinds of surveys showed that people had a very positive, European citizens had a very positive image of Chinese culture, for instance, and then a very negative issue of opinion of Chinese politics, which implies that it's far less about the opinion rather than the category of issue. And now, of course, China's political system linked to China's economic presence, linked to European policies across the board are being meshed together, especially in public discourse and media. So if you're talking about handling China's image, I think that's something our policy realities still have to adapt to. The fact that these issues can be separated neatly when in a heatedly politicized debate. So in that sense, I think that's something that ought to be looked at in terms of trying to handle Chinese soft power differently. I guess maybe the question behind the question is, has Europe or have European governments been naive about receiving these positive projections of China's image, and have they forgotten the hard geopolitical reality that lies behind it? And I think in part yes, and in part no. I think sure, I think that the attention to Chinese geopolitical strategy on the long term was very low in many European countries 10 years ago, and is now all of a sudden very high on the agenda. And that could have happened a bit earlier, and we would have been all the wiser for it. Then again, there has been a real change in Chinese policy since, at least in Xi Jinping, and certainly in the last couple of years, that well, you could have projected, but it wasn't necessarily going to happen. So these things aren't set in stone, and therefore to have seen that already happening 10 years ago would have been a fantasy, I think. So if you then try to, well, if you ask me to define the essence of the challenge, it is to, I would say, first of all, accept the reality as it is, and that is that China is a symptom of a world order that is essentially contested along political and ideological lines, and that Europe as a community and as a group of countries would have a strong interest in finding common ways of navigating that essentially contested world. So my point would be that as China is changing into a more comprehensive discursive power mode, where it tries to gain influence in a very heatedly contested and politicized global debate, Europe must find a way to similarly protect its right to speak. I don't think that implies a strong or animus relationship with China, or not necessarily, at least, but it far more implies all sorts of challenges for European countries to, at least on issues, speak with one voice, and to project a strong narrative that can compete with China and other powers in that global discursive space. So I think that would be a challenge, and the challenge again is more for Europe than for this, in particular Europe's relation to China. But China does pose that challenge to us.
Another question is, can we still speak of soft power now that Chinese tone is mainly aggressive? It would be interesting to hear the views from the three country experts that are here. So perhaps from France, Germany, and Italy, your response to this question, starting with Marc.
Okay, I think I have already answered the question in my presentation, because I think in France, at least from our perspective with John Seaman, the soft power strategy or soft power policy is it doesn't exist any longer in France. So, and as I said, I think China has renounced to soft power and now favor power struggle and intimidation to force this way.
Barbara?
Yeah, thanks. Can we still speak of soft power in Germany? Yeah, I've also would like to emphasize that definitely soft power has dwindled in Germany, but it still exists, especially the economic aspect, as I outlined, is relatively strong, but yeah, in line and in connection with the will, of course, to be a discursive power. This assertiveness and the coercive measures in Germany dominate and becoming more intense. So yeah, soft power has dwindled and is becoming less and less in Germany.
Francesca?
I think Italy is a bit of an exception so far, in terms we haven't really been at the receiving end of any sort of assertive or threatening type of narrative. The Chinese narrative towards Italy is still largely positive. Also, to a certain degree, quiet. There's not too much engagement. There's been an increasing engagement lately in regard to Xinjiang in terms of, proposing a different narrative, but it's still very positive. So I think that Italy is a good case study in supporting what Sean Breslin argues, that, Chinese soft power would be so much more powerful if Beijing didn't just meddle into it because of the culture, because of the language. But again, as I said before, I don't know whether we're gonna see a change in China's narrative towards Italy now that the government has become more assertive towards China.
Okay, Paul, maybe if I can just add one point to keep in mind. From many of the reporting countries, a message was put forward that soft power on the whole, or aimed at the national government of a particular country by China, may be deteriorating quickly. There are stark differences sometimes between, for instance, different local government, between local government and national government, between industrial elites and the general audience. So soft power may linger, and it may linger on different levels than just, national TV, parliament, government. And that's not unimportant. So it was not for nothing that when the trade war with the US started, there was a big appeal to US states to help foster a good relationship with China, to undo some of these national policies set by Washington. And indeed, the soft power of China in those decentralized ties was very instrumental in that. So soft power on the whole may be deteriorating, but it does linger on different levels, and that's very important to keep in mind, I think.
Okay, thank you. We are nearing the end of the session. there's one more question that I would like to ask perhaps all four panelists to reflect on. I will read out the question. The question is, you seem to consider that Chinese soft power failed because of the feeling of the EU members' population towards China, but the aim of China's soft power and influence are not to be attractive to EU people, it's to be attractive to European money. So at this point of view, actually, so China's soft power approach is working well, says the question, because the commercial balance is still and even more beneficial, increasingly beneficial to China. So what about this point of view, where even though the public relations, the public opinion image of China is deteriorating, but actually commercial objectives or economic objectives perhaps are still being met successfully by China?
I'll start very quickly. I think first we need to differentiate between commercial and economic, because if we think about commercial, in some cases it's just not soft power. It's just, you know, how globalization works, and at a certain point you have this sort of exchanges. And if you think about economy, I'm not quite sure on that side either, because to a certain point of view, I mean, Chinese market is quite closed. So if they wanted to be more attractive for European money, then they would open more sectors, right? So I'm not quite sure whether I'm squaring this question properly. If the question is whether what we were saying before, the economic attraction of a potential future expansion of European enterprises in the Chinese market is still there and is still very strong in Europe and in Italy as well, then yes, if that is the question, absolutely, Chinese soft power on that side hasn't failed. But yeah, if Chinese soft power is attraction, and attraction through economy is definitely going well and is being very successful.
Anyone else who would like to respond on this topic?
Yeah, just because indeed we have 2 minutes left, I'll be very quick. I'd say also give it a couple of years. So now in a very rapid tempo, European audiences are linking Chinese economic presence to all kinds of political and geopolitical issues that it wouldn't link that to those issues, well, for I guess 3 years ago. So that separation of the economic and the non-economic, it was perhaps a viable strategy a couple of years ago, but it's rapidly losing its relevance. So even if that may be the case now, and it's certainly the case in a number of countries, I think also in a number of countries that's gonna change quite quickly. So let's keep an eye on that too, I guess.
Marc?
Okay. Yeah, I think even in the business sector, the relationship with China is harder and harder. If you ask, for example, recently H&M, the coercion by China, the sanctions on European businesses happens more and more often, and also the European consumers. So we go back to the public opinion. The European consumers also weigh in the equation, and they also can influence the European companies.
Barbara?
Yeah, also very quick. So I have a similar opinion than Francesca. So if we only measure soft power on this aspect, as this question implies, then yes, I think it hasn't failed in Germany. But yeah, also one specifically interesting point in the German context is related to this economic appeal, that there's a quite diversified actors group. So this debate is not just business versus politics, but basically this reckoning of China on value issues in Germany has also been done in part by the business community. So, for example, I also mentioned the BDI statement before. So I think it's kind of also dwindling if you measure this on the economic aspect of soft power. And on the other side, we have these prominent companies like Volkswagen, BMW, and which has been prominent in the attitude of Merkel's approach, the Chancellor's approach. So there are these two camps in Germany, which yeah, you can consider when considering if soft power is only effective if the commercial aspect is still very prominent there.
Thank you, Barbara. And with that, we have reached the end of this session. I would very much like to thank all participants and everybody who posed questions. There were a lot of interesting questions that we were not able to address because there's just not enough time. So thank you very much for your attention and for watching. Also, thank you to Barbara, Marc, Francesca, and Ties for their very interesting presentations and contributions in the discussion. I would just like to end by reminding everybody that the report, China Soft Power in Europe by ETNC, is available online. It's available from the Clingendael website, but I'm sure it's also available from the websites of the other ETNC institutes. And this session is available on YouTube, and it's also available later on for everybody who missed it and wants to watch it on YouTube. So thank you very much, and we hope to welcome you at another Clingendael webinar at another occasion.
Thank you.